My name is Dan Hadley, and like most of you, I'm obsessed with railroading. What you just viewed were scenes I shot for Pentrex at Abo Canyon in 1994. I'd like to explain how I became a videographer for Pentrex. The journey began in 1988. I had no intentions of becoming a professional railfan or a railroad videographer. That happened when presented with one of those life-altering experiences. I was working at ABC 7 in Chicago as a videographer, and I loved my job. I'll get to the detour in a moment. As a serious amateur railfan, I thought of shooting railroad video for my own use, but the idea of selling hadn't come to mind. Fellow railfan Steve Zahn and I were planning a trip to visit the Lake Superior and Ishpeming. Their older model Alco and GE locomotives were calling, and we wanted to see those beasts while still operating. I asked management if I could use company camera equipment, and to my surprise, they agreed. Steve and I headed to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan to record the footage you're viewing. Pentrex was doing a huge amount of advertising in those days, so I was aware of them, but had not viewed any videos. Dave Bussey, a fellow videographer at ABC in Los Angeles and an accomplished railroad photographer, told me he'd produced a video about the Arkansas and Missouri. He said he was selling the video to Pentrex and told me what they were paying. That got my attention. The idea for Michigan Ore Lines was born, and this became my first Pentrex show. I sold it to them outright, but in the future I'd agree to a royalty arrangement.
The Lake Superior and Ishpeming Railroad, one of the last bastions of first-generation Alco motive power, exists for a single purpose: iron ore. It moves taconite pellets from mine to ore dock in heavy trains of ore jennings.
The narrator of Ore Lines was not Dave Drury, the voice of Pentrex. If you're from the Chicago area, you may recognize the narrator's voice as none other than Paul Meinke, a well-respected reporter and former colleague. Paul agreed to do the narration as a friend. In the meantime, my work at ABC continued, and whenever possible, I tried to connect work with my railroad hobby. Shots of rail yards were possible when assigned Skycam duty. On an Operation Lifesaver trip, I rode in Burlington Northern's theater car. As part of that story, I also rode an E-unit trying to capture near misses at grade crossings. Drivers were well behaved that day, so nothing to show but a good time. An overseas trip took me to Switzerland, where I found time to hang out at the main train station in Zurich. While there, I also became totally fascinated with that city's streetcars. On an assignment to Vietnam, I found ancient steam locomotives still alive in Hanoi. Now about that life-altering experience. ABC began staff cutbacks in 1986, laying off 30 people a year for the next 3 years. At the end of downsizing, they reached my seniority number, and I became the last person cut. As dire as it seemed at the time, it was actually a blessing in disguise and permitted me to start producing railroad videos full-time. I didn't actually work for Pentrex, although you'd never know it from this photo, but earned my income on royalties as tapes sold. It was a very worthwhile venture for Pentrex and for myself. And even better, to ease the transition in careers, I was able to work freelance for ABC when not away shooting railroads. Over the next 12 years, I produced over 80 titles. A couple of the early shows were Today's Chicago Railroads and Burlington Northern E-units. No surprise here, as they were both right in my backyard. I've set music to clips from those shows. Now here's a look back in time. Cass Scenic Railroad's Railfan Weekend was one of the first steam shows I did. That program taught me a valuable lesson, and that steam videos sold nearly 4 times that of diesels. This may come as a surprise, but I didn't like shooting steam. It was dangerous trying to get ahead of trains for additional shots, and it was difficult with crowds of people in the way. The worst were people pacing locomotives mile after mile down a highway. But from this point forward, I made an effort and produced 9 steam shows. I also worked directly with Pentrex on many of the steam extravaganzas of that era. Of the steam shows I produced, 2765, A New River Masquerade, is my favorite. I was able to ride the locomotive to get video and audio of engineer Rich Melvin at work. Since they ran multiple trips, I could leapfrog ahead to obtain enough footage to make a show. When Pentrex produced their big steam shows, they used a minimum of 3 camera crews, sometimes more.
Nickel plate Berkshire 765, with the numeral 2 added before its number, was repainted and altered to closely approximate a Kanawha. The locomotive wowed the crowds as it stomped up and down the line for the annual fall foliage trips. Engineer Rich Melvin is wired for sound and explains what he's doing, telling us how the engine is performing as the train heads up the line. He has his hands full as the wet rail causes the engine to slip its drivers time after time.
Now we're getting into where the grade steepens a little bit. We're okay to go 40. And if it will hold the rail, we'll go 40. But it does things like that.
So what's a videographer's thoughts when setting up a shot, and what drives the creative process? In my case, I approach railroad video from my background in television news, where my job was to tell a story with images that answer the classic 5 W's of journalism: who, what, when, where, and why. In videography, we capture movement. Accordingly, we move the camera to follow an object's path by tilting, panning, or utilizing different focal lengths to either emphasize the subject or widen to show a different field of view. This is called zoom if done while recording. Rarely would you see a Hollywood director call for a zoom shot. They have other tricks at their calling that we don't have, like dolly, crane, or tracking shots. They also have the opportunity to perform multiple takes until they get it right. Knowing how and when to perform camera movement is something that comes with practice and intuition. Intuition for me is a huge part of the creative process. Let's take another look at the video we just viewed of the 2765. That version featured clips edited differently from the Pentrex version because I was no longer documenting an event, but creating a music video. Runtime and shot selection were dictated by the music. This shot worked great in the music version, but actually came midway through the full version. I was set up to get shots of the engine to show how it differs in appearance from a real Kanawha. Then the drivers unexpectedly slipped. I simply followed the engine without adjusting the shot in any way. This was to provide space for narration to discuss the aesthetics of the locomotive. One thing that's very important in videography is to provide editors shots to use to cover narration. The shot of the train coming directly at the camera was shortened considerably from the original. Here's what that looked like in the Pentrex release. It begins with the subject out of frame, and then it appears. That's a powerful image. I believe any time a videographer gets the opportunity to shoot into the Z-axis, it's going to create a powerful image, and that's exactly what I intended. The Z-axis represents depth, and there's nothing more powerful, in my opinion, than creating depth to a scene. Now let's view what happens. An adjustment will have to be made in order to keep the locomotive in frame. A slow zoom will do the job, or I could use an edit. I chose to keep the sequence intact without an edit because the audio of the drivers slipping was so good I didn't want to interrupt it. An edit cuts to the cars going away. There are choices, and it could have been a static shot, or I could have chosen a slow zoom as the cars trail into the distance. And why use this trailing shot at all? The reason is to set up the next location. The train is going somewhere, and in telling the story, it just makes sense to show this. It connects the scenes to make a sequence. Because I chose to do it this way doesn't make it right or wrong. I believe it helps transport the viewer from one scene to the next. This shot is a killer, in my opinion. These are the magic moments we as photographers or videographers live for. Going to the high ground was a choice which would permit me to get as much as possible out of this scene. I didn't think about it. I just took off running. If I'd shot at the grade crossing, it would have not been an impressive shot at all. How did I decide to do it this way? I have no idea other than to say it was either intuition or dumb luck. I'm willing to take dumb luck when it's handed out. It wasn't easy running up that hill toting 45 pounds of gear, but I'm sure glad I did. Wouldn't happen today. The pan shot was a natural. As soon as I saw steam mixing with fog, I had to follow the action. Yes, I could have done it as an edit, separating the coming and going, but I believe an edit would have broken the continuity to this amazing scene. Now I'm standing in the tinder's coal pile getting images of steam and smoke trailing back from the locomotive. And yes, They are creating a z-axis vector. Every time black smoke appeared, it was a telltale sign the drivers had slipped. Turning around provided a view ahead with scenery coming at me. Another powerful screen action shot. Here's the importance of a cut shot. I'm telling a story, and the slipping drivers are a huge part of that story. I couldn't shoot them from inside the cab, but I could get a shot of the speedometer. Looking forward, recording the play of steam, smoke, and vapor hitting the lens just what? I want to tell you that this entire cab ride almost didn't happen. Rich Melvin had his hands full that day and worked relentlessly to make the engine perform. When I asked if I could ride along, he was hesitant, but the showman in him said, "Okay." Thank you, Rich, for your generosity. At Stretcher's Neck Tunnel, there were several options for shot selection. I could join the photo line, but instead decided I'd include them to help tell the story. Many curse those who get out in front, but they were there first and they were part of the story. Again, this could have been done as a cut shot with edit, but I chose a pan. The pan won out because it kept the continuity of the train going somewhere, and it gave more screen time to the locomotive, the star of the production. An overlooked aspect of shooting video is to remember one is also recording sound. In setting up this shot, I needed to roll extra early to write narration to explain the scene. I also wanted to record the approaching locomotive's audio through the tunnel long before it came into view. Next we have what I absolutely love, and that's a train in a sweeping S-curve. I think we all live for shots like this. The Z-axis is working, the wide shot shows smoke high above the train, and look way back to the left. You can see the 33-car train coming around the far end of the curve. After panning off the old coaling tower, I set the shot, but soon realized I'd have to make a slight adjustment. A tilt of the camera upward was necessary to observe how high the smoke was rising. A cut shot here to hide camera movement would have interrupted this live-on-tape moment. I had the intuition to place myself where I did in the long S-curve, but needed one last fix to the focal length. This would make it possible to let the engine come to me without further adjustment. After panning the drivers, I followed the action to view the train completing its journey through the curve with the smoke and cars following. In my opinion, this may be one of the best shots I ever had the opportunity to shoot. And why? Because the gloomy skies made for shadowless, flat lighting, which made the image pop rather than being a nondescript blob. The concluding location in this presentation, like the very first shot, starts with the train out of frame and then lets it enter. On this shot, I had to either zoom out or do an edit because it was imperative to show the station at Prince. Anyone who knows this piece of railroad would be very disappointed if the station was not included. After all, that's why I set up where I did. Aha! I put an edit here rather than following the action. Why? I have no idea. Maybe I was tired of pan shots. Maybe I had uneven footing to walk the camera around. Maybe another photographer was in the way. I don't know why. This was 31 years ago. So let me say this about setting up shots. Honestly, they just happen without much forethought because a steam chase is a frantic exercise and you've got to let your gut intuition guide you. There's absolutely no time to mess with or think about shot selection. You either get it or you don't. And that's exactly like shooting news stories where there's no, oops, I missed the action. When it comes to a steam chase or when on a news stakeout, one had better be recording or face the consequences. My inventory of completed shows continued to expand, and the royalty payments soon surpassed what I'd been making at ABC. It was with extreme pleasure when I refused the company's recall to return to work, and I can tell you, I was having the time of my life having become a professional Railfan. Of the videos I've produced, I'm most proud of the mini-doc titled Vanishing Towers. This is an important piece that, unlike the eye candy of train run-bys, explores and preserves a part of railroading that has nearly disappeared. Here's a condensed version of that video. It can be viewed in its entirety for free on YouTube.
Towers are symbols of another era, a time we'd like to freeze forever. Like other icons from earlier days of railroading, the towers too shall fall. Gone are active passenger stations located in nearly every small town. Gone are crossing shanties, water tanks, coaling towers, roundhouses, and more. The list goes on and on. We're fortunate to have had the opportunity to coexist with many of our cherished icons well after their useful purpose had expired. But now it's time to say goodbye to the towers, a symbol of joys experienced and of our time invested down by the tracks. But the saddest part of this farewell is to say goodbye to the tower operators. They were a source of information to many a Railfan, a human interface with the railroad that has no replacement. Many operators were friends, mentors, and many were actually Railfans themselves. The crossover switches at HO Tower are controlled by levers, and these levers can be very cantankerous. They're connected to switch locks, derails, and switches by rod linkage. Throwing these levers moves the rods down the length of the plant, and the tired old equipment can sometimes put up a fight. Ginger Stanley is one of the few women operators capable of working the levers at HO, and she's not thrilled to perform a demonstration. But with a little sweet talking by yours truly, she agreed to give them and herself a little exercise.
Got it.
Had I stayed with ABC, my union pension would be incredible. But I've had the time of my life shooting railroads all over North America and have never been sorry not returning to the daily grind of shooting news stories. Many of my former co-workers didn't live to retirement because of stress and the toll it took on their bodies. I'm grateful for the opportunity I had. Thank you for inviting me here today to share my journey of becoming a professional Railfan.